All right, so thank you. So today I'm going to talk to you about laser plasma interactions and modeling these interactions using particle and cell methods. I'm Tsung from UCLA. I'm the co-PI of the project. And this talk is done with contributions from Victor Desic, who's a staff member of our group, and two postdocs, Wei-Ming An and Xinlu Xu, and also Diana Amorin from IST in Portugal. And the PI of the group is Warren Mori from UCLA as well. Oh, that's right. So the talk is broken up roughly into 4 parts. In the first part, I'm going to talk to you a little bit about the particle and cell method. I'm going to try to stand still. About the particle and cell method, and tell you what it is and our particular implementation of it called Osiris, and tell you what it has done and how it's doing on blue waters. And then I'm going to show you 2 particular applications of the PIC model related to the laser plasma interaction problem. And the first one, I'm going to talk to you about plasma-based accelerators. In these cases, 3D simulations the data produced by 3D simulations can be used to compare quantitatively with experiments. So these simulations are all done with collaboration in support of ongoing experiments. And I'm going to talk to you about a quick PIC simulation of positron acceleration experiment at SLAC, which stands for Stanford Linear Accelerator. And I'm also going to show you a large 3D simulation of a laser Wakefield accelerator in the self-modulated regime. This is done in support of a large laser at Lawrence Livermore Laboratory. And then the second example is that of a laser fusion. And I'm going to show you some large 2D and 3D simulations of laser plasma interactions relevant to laser fusion. And also going to give you some estimates on what it takes to do a large 3D simulation that's relevant to experiments. And I'm going to show you that these simulations cannot be done on today's computers, and this would justify the need for new numerical methods and also to new algorithms for the exascale supercomputers. And I will spend the last few minutes of my talk telling you about what we're doing to develop new numerical methods and also new algorithms for GPUs and multi-cores. All right. So particle and cell methods, what is it? So particle and cell methods, as the name implies, consists mainly of particles and grids. And so it treats the plasma as a collection of particles. And the interaction of these particles doesn't scale as the number of particle squares because the particle quantities are first deposited to a grid and the interaction force is calculated on the grid only. And because the number of particles is much larger than the number of grids, the timing is mostly dominated by the particle calculation. So therefore, the timing scales as linearly as the number of particles. And the PIC loop goes something like this. So because it's a loop, so you can start anywhere. So first you calculate you use the force interpolated from the grid to calculate the new orbit. And once you calculate the new position and the new momentum, and you can use it to deposit grid quantities such as current density or charge density. And once you have the current density and the charge density, you can solve the electric field and the magnetic field. And you use the electric field and the magnetic field to generate the force, and the loop continues. And so the code usually spends about 90% of the time solving these 4 blocks inside the PIC loop. And these 4 blocks accounts for only about 2% of the total code in the production code. So I think optimizing these codes are fairly easy, because if you work hard in optimizing these four subroutines, you will do very well on any platform you decide to use. So our particular implementation of the PIC model is called Osiris. It's a very mature model that's been used for a long time. So it has many, many features. And so I think the features that's of most interest to this community is that it's shown good scaling up to about 1.6 million cores on the Sequoia supercomputer. And on blue waters, we have achieved over a sustained speed of 2.2 petaflops on blue waters. And we have a hybrid parallelism using OpenMP and MPI. And we have there's an Osiris development branch for CUDA and also Intel PHYs. And so in addition to the problems I'm going to be talking to you about today, later on this afternoon, there's also some example of using Osiris for a space physics problem do works that Sam has done, magnetic reconnection that you can see, I think, in this room at 2:30. All right. So now let's jump to the physics. So I'm going to be talking to you about two physics problems today, and the first problem I want to talk to you about is that of the plasma-based accelerator. So the plasma-based accelerator is mainly made up of three parts. The first part is the driving beam, which loses energy and produces a wave inside the plasma, and the trailing beam, which uses a plasma wave and use that and take the energy from the plasma wave and gains energy. And the plasma, the third part is the plasma, which transfers the energy from the driving beam to the trailing beam. And the driving beam can be that, or can be an electron beam, or can be a laser. In the case of an electron beam, this is called a PWFA, or a plasma wake field accelerator. Or in the case where the laser is used as a driver, that's called LWFA, or a laser wake field accelerator. So why do we need to use plasmas? The need to have plasma-based accelerator can be seen if you look at what's called the Livingston curve, which shows the energy, which shows the highest energy achieved in accelerators as a function of time. So the first accelerator is built around 1930 in Berkeley. It's the cyclotron built by Lawrence, and the Lawrence Livermore Lab is named after him. And you can see that it has enjoyed an exponential growth from 1930 all the way up until 1980, and at that point, the curve has saturated. So the reason for the saturation is very simple, because energy is the product of force times distance. So the maximum amount of force that can be applied in conventional accelerators is determined by the so-called breakdown voltage of metal. So if you can only apply a certain amount of field in metals. Above that, the metals will tend to spark and it will break down. So then at that point, the only way to increase energies in your accelerators is to make them bigger and bigger. And so that gets increasingly expensive, so the curve has saturated. However, plasma, because it's made up of electrons and ions, it's already broken down, so it doesn't have the same limit as that of metal. So you can put much bigger fields in a plasma, and conceivably you can make accelerators much smaller and can get it to much higher energy. So at the same curve, I'm showing you the progress we made with plasma-based accelerators in the past 30 years. And on this curve, you can see the plasma-based accelerators enjoying an exponential growth for the past 30 years. And in these plots, the red dots indicate experiments done using laser drivers, and the blue dots indicate experiments done using beam drivers. And as you can see, we're catching up to conventional accelerators, at least in terms of maximum energy. So as I mentioned before, the simulations done here can be used to compare with experiments directly. And so these simulations I'll be showing are also in support of these experiments. The first experiment I'm going to be talking about is the facet experiment done at the Stanford Linear Accelerator. So here's the schematics of the Stanford Linear Accelerator, which is a 3-kilometer long device. And so this is the entire length of the accelerator. And at the end of the 3 kilometers, the electron or the positron beam gains the peak energy about 40 GeVs. And the facet experiment is located around the 2-kilometer mark. And so the energy for electrons and positrons is about 20 GeVs at this distance. And so this translates to a gradient about 100 megavolts per meter. And inside the facet experiment, these electron beams or positron beams go through a small amount of plasma, and it gets a tremendous energy boost. And the facet experiment has enjoyed a lot of support from simulations, and the highlight from these simulations is, of course, the Nature cover from last year, where a simulation done on blue waters made it onto the cover of Nature. And this is a slide that I showed from last year's symposium, where I showed the cover on Nature and also the experimental results. So in last year, what's done in SLAC is that they send 2 electron beams into a plasma that is about 36 centimeters long. And so in the 2-bunch experiment, they both start out at energy about 20 GeV, and one bunch loses energy, as you can see here, that initially the 2 bunches are overlapped in terms of energy, and you can see one bunch start to lose energy, and the trailing bunch gains about 2 GeVs in the distance about 40 centimeters, and you can see it takes 3 kilometers to go from 0 to 20 GeV, and it takes less than 1 meter to go from 20 to 22 GeV. So you can see the tremendous potentials that plasma has for future accelerators. And you can see also there's very good agreement between our simulations and experiments, and you can see the simulation data here of the energy spectrum is plotted in green, and it compares very well with the experimental data, which is plotted in blue. And as you can see from last year's slide, I'm promising you that for this year, I'm going to show you some results involving positrons, and that's what I'm going to do for the next couple of minutes. So this year, in SLAC, they have done some experiments using positron beams. And as you can see, so here's a cartoon of a plasma-based collider design, where on the left, you have an electron beam driving a wake, and the trailing bunch is accelerated. And on the other side, you see a wake that's driven by a positron beam. And you can see the wake that's driven by an electron beam is very different than that of a wake driven by a positron beam. The reason for that is very simple, because here the plasma is made with normal matter rather than antimatter. So if you have a positron beam and a plasma that's made out of antimatters, the wake would look exactly the same in both cases. But they're not. In both cases, the plasma is made from real matters. So therefore, the wake look very different. And the nonlinear plasma wave that's driven by an electron beam is very well understood. We've been studying that for 30 years. But the wake that's driven by a positron beam is less well understood than that of electron beams. So for these positron experiments, we rely very heavily on the simulation results to give us insights on these positron experiments. All right. So on the right, you see a series of shots down at SLAC, and this result was published last year in the journal Nature. And you can see in SLAC experiments, initially these positrons had the energy of about 20 GeV, and in 1.3 meters of plasma, the positrons gain anywhere between 3 to 10 GeVs of energy. And with very narrow energy spread, the energy spread goes anywhere from 4 to 6% and as low as 1.8%. So, and the simulations, that's right, the movie doesn't play. The simulations play a very important role in understanding what leads to the narrow energy spread, and I'm going to explain that to you with the plot shown here. It was a movie on my Mac, but here it's just a snapshot. So on the lower left, you see the positron phase space, and you see this in this experiment, a single positron beam is used both as the driver and as a driving bunch and the trailing bunch. So you can see some particles lose energy and some particles gain energy. And on top, you see many things being plotted at the same time. So you see a slice of the plasma density shown with the blue color map, and the positron density shown in the orange color map, and the axial line out of the accelerating field shown as a line out in red. So what the simulation is telling us is that the positron beam, because there are so many positrons sitting at the accelerating phase of the wake, they have modified the wake in a way that the accelerating field is flat. So therefore, all the positrons are being accelerated at the same rate. And if you see the movie, you will see that all the positrons in the trailing bunch are being accelerated at the same rate, and they move up in phase space roughly at the same rate, leading to these monoenergetic features in experiments. So simulations gave us a lot of insight on these features that's observed in the experiments. And this result was published in this high impact journal Nature. So another example of our simulations in supported experiments is the 3D OSIRIS simulations of the laser wake field experiment that's currently being conducted at the Titan Laser at Lawrence Livermore Laboratory. So in this experiment, a 150 joule laser that's 1 picosecond long is sent into a plasma, and it generates electrons with energy up to about 200 MeV. The energy number is not very impressive, but there's a lot of electrons, and the electrons can produce hard X-rays that's highly directional, mostly going forward. And here is the X-ray radiation pattern that's generated from our simulation and post-processed. And one very interesting thing you can see here is that the X-ray pattern is highly asymmetric, suggesting that 3D effects are very important in these simulations. So, and the simulations is very challenging and really requires the resource of blue waters. So the simulations for this experiment in 3D requires about 30 billion cells and about 1 trillion particles. And each simulation takes about 500,000 core hours on blue waters. But the memory demand is quite heavy, and I don't think we can do this elsewhere. And the simulations are ongoing, and hopefully we will have more results for you at the next year's Blue Water Symposium. So, all right, so now let's move to the next physics topic, which is that of the laser fusion. So in laser fusion, the goal of laser fusion is that lasers used to, so here's the lasers used to compress a fusion pellet, and the goal here is trying to extract more energy from fusion than the input energy from that of lasers. So as you can see from our last set of simulations, in the case of plasma-based accelerators, the goal is to use lasers to drive as much plasma wave as possible. But here, the goal is exactly the opposite. So in this case, we're actually trying to eliminate plasma waves in these systems. Because in laser fusion, laser-plasma interactions can be detrimental to these experiments for 2 reasons. One, the laser lights can be scattered backwards and toward the source and cannot reach the target. And also, the laser light, as you've seen before, produces plasma waves, which can accelerate electrons. And these electrons can then heat up the target and will increase the temperature and pressure of the fusion target, making the target much harder to compress with the laser. So here, the goal is to minimize the laser-plasma interactions as much as possible. So this is a very challenging problem because all the temporal and the length scale involved in this problem. So in terms of length scales, it spans about 3 orders of magnitude from 1 micron, which is roughly the length scale of the laser, to about 1 millimeter, which is roughly the laser propagation length. And the time scale involved spans 6 orders of magnitude from 1 femtosecond, which is roughly the period of the laser, to about 1 nanosecond, which is the duration of the laser pulse. And a typical PIC simulation only lasts about 10 picoseconds. And so we're still not anywhere near the capability needed to model the entire laser. So so in the past, we've been doing a lot of simulations in 1D using the code OSIRIS. And this is what a typical workflow is like using the 1D OSIRIS. So at the end of each laser shot, the experimentalist can run a hydrocode and produce the plasma conditions inside the fusion target. And so we can find out the density and the temperature in the horon. And so here is a snapshot of the plasma density inside the target. And you can see so here in the middle is the gas, and on one side is the fusion target, and on the other side is actually more material being blown off by the laser. So you see 2 high density areas here, and in the middle is just gas. So you can take this profile, you can take this density and temperature profile and run a series of 1D simulations along several paths. And from these 1D OSIRIS simulations, you can get information such as the spectrum of the backscatter light, which can be used to compare against experiments. you can see the spectrum of the hot electrons, and also you can get energy partitioned, which is just a fancy way of saying how the incident laser energy is partitioned into light that reached the target, the transmitted light, or light that's backscattered due to LPI, and also the light that's converted into energetic electrons. And each of these 1D simulations is fairly modest, only takes about 100 CPU hours and can be done on a small cluster. However, that's just not enough for some of these problems. And as we find out through our 2D and 3D simulations, that we find this problem has many higher dimensional effects. So the main reason for that is that the laser pulse, the laser profile is not at all a plane wave, but it's really made up of many these hotspots called speckles. And so each one of these speckles is about 3 or 4 microns large, and these speckles can also move in time. And these speckles, so one of these hotspots can trigger LPI activities elsewhere. So you can have situations where the laser is actually below the LPI threshold, but in fact, you can observe LPI activities. And in our 2D and 3D simulations, we find that there are 3 mechanisms where a above threshold hotspot can trigger LPI activities elsewhere. And the 3 main mechanisms are one, seeding from a backscatter light from one speckle to another, and then also seeding from of a plasma wave, seeding a plasma wave from one speckle to another, and also the process called inflation, where energetic electrons can move from one speckle to another, and these energetic electrons can change the distribution function and reduce plasma wave damping and promotes growth of LPIs. And so currently what we're looking at is, so there's an additional higher dimensional effect, which is external magnetic fields. And in recent experiments and also recent simulations, we have shown that external magnetic field can reduce LPI activities. And this is something we've been looking at in our recent simulations on blue waters, but I think I'm going to skip that due to time. And just to show you that right now, what we're doing on blue waters is 2D simulations using multiple speckles, or 3D simulations with one speckle. And these simulations roughly the same in size and also in time. So each of these simulations uses about 300 billion particles and takes about 10 million CPU hours each. But however, in order to do a multi-speckle simulation in 3D, it takes about 22 trillion particles and take about 1 billion CPU hours using today's processors. And that translates to about 2 full months on blue waters, and it's simply not possible today. So really, we need to do a lot of work in co-development, and this is what I'm going to be talking about last. So we're developing new numerical methods and also new algorithms for GPUs and multi-cores. And so the first thing I want to talk to you about is our effort to develop a cylindrical Osiris with azimuthal modal expansion. So as you've seen in these early results, both a single speckle LPI with a single speckle and also the 3D laser wake field problem, the incident laser is very symmetric cylindrically. And so you can imagine simulating these things with a cylindrical model, but of course that's not possible because the laser light is not polarized in the R direction or the phi direction, the azimuthal angle direction, but it's usually polarized in X or Y. So you cannot use a simple RZ model to model the laser. Of course, a few years ago, Lifshitz et al. Developed the ability to model plasmas in 3D using RZ and phi by introducing a Fourier decomposition in the phi direction. And so using this decomposition at the simple identity that EX and EY can be written by in terms of ER and E phi in this way, you can see that you can model a linearly polarized laser with one additional mode in phi, and you can do 3D problems at the cost of several 2D simulations. And so And we have extended this work further to enforce charge conservation and eliminate the need to solve the Poisson's equation. And this work was published last year in the Journal of Computational Physics. And we benchmarked our 2D cylindrical code against some previous 3D simulations, and we find that the agreement is quite good, and we get a time saving of 1 to 2 orders of magnitude in the benchmark problems. However, as I mentioned before, there are some problems that just doesn't have the symmetry needed to be modeled with a cylindrical code, and also you still need to port our PIC codes to the next generation of processors, such as GPUs or Intels. And we're also moving in that direction as well. So now we have a PIC code running on the GPU, and on the GPU, we apply a domain decomposition on the GPU using the concept of tiles. So the tiles is a very small domain that's usually 2 by 2 or 2 16 by 16 grids. And each tile is associated with each thread block on the GPU. And in order to do domain decomposition on the tile, you have to provide the extra index for the particle quantities. So there's a new index, so which is roughly the tile ID for this particle. And there's a small amount of overhead involved in this algorithm. So at each time step, you have to make sure the particle is in the correct tile, and you have to write a particle manager. But Victor Daszak, who is the person responsible for this algorithm, argues that this overhead is quite small because at each time step, most of the particles are sitting at the right tile, and the movement is very minimal. And also that we know how to write this because this is essentially message passing inside the GPU, and we already know how to do that. So we implemented this code on the GPU, and as you can see on the Intel Fermi, it achieves about a 51 times speed up compared to that single core of an Intel i7. And what's more interesting is that we have taken the GPU code and implemented it using OpenMP, and you can see on the Intel processor, 12-core Intel processor using OpenMP, we also get a speed up on nearly 12 times speed up. So it's 95% efficient on a 12-core single Intel chip. So we think that there's a lot of potential in this method. And we also, so what about multiple GPUs? And we have also done that. And we have also implemented the GPU code on a cluster of GPUs. And on our local cluster with about 110 GPUs, we get a speed up of 77 times, or roughly 70% efficiency. And just so finally, I want to tell you that all of the codes I mentioned earlier is available on our Pixie website, which is located at pixie.edry.ucla.edu. And Pixie stands for Particle in Cell and Kinetic Simulation Software Center. It's an NSF-funded center. It has a 5-year life cycle, and we're at the end of our year 2. And the goals of the Pixie Center are to provide skeleton codes like those I showed you earlier that allows you to learn how to how to write PIC codes on traditional architectures and also new architectures such as the GPU, and also provides you with MPI-based codes that can run on your home cluster and also run on some of the largest supercomputers in the world, like Blue Waters. And also provides educational software that allow you to demonstrate difficult concepts in plasma physics. And also, another very useful thing is that it's a repo to document the best and worst practices for code writing, and which is often unpublished and get rediscovered all over the world. So I think having a center like this, where these things are documented, is also very useful. And so all these codes I mentioned are available through open source license. And we're still looking for good postdocs. So if you're interested, please come and talk to me. And so here's the summary of my talk again. So I introduced you to the particle and cell method, and also show you how we use the particle and cell method to look at 2 problems related to laser plasma interactions, and also show you what we're doing on future architectures. So thank you very much, and I'd like to give a special thanks to the Blue Water team for the continuing technical support and the unlimited supply of computing resources. Thank you.